A night out at a restaurant is usually filled with laughter, aromas of fresh meals, and the comfort of being surrounded by people enjoying themselves. Nobody at that place thought the evening would turn into something so dark that it would be remembered forever. The restaurant was crowded, the lights warm and inviting, music playing softly in the background, and glasses clinking together. Couples talked in low voices, friends took pictures of their plates, and families enjoyed time together. It looked like any other evening until one chilling moment shattered the calm and turned everything into panic. In the middle of casual conversations and friendly chatter, a sound tore through the air that silenced the entire place. Screams followed instantly as people realized what had just happened. There, in front of everyone's eyes, was a murder so sudden, so cold, that for a second it felt unreal. But the horror was undeniable. In a place where people had come to celebrate life, someone's life ended violently, and no one could escape what they saw. The victim had been sitting at a table not far from the center of the restaurant. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The person was dining, speaking, and moving with the same comfort as everyone else. But unnoticed by most, a storm was quietly building. A figure had been watching, waiting, and when the time came, the atmosphere of safety disappeared in a flash. A single act changed the meaning of that night. People dropped their forks and glasses, some froze in disbelief, and others ducked behind tables. The shock was so overwhelming that the seconds felt like hours. Some rushed for the door, some crouched in corners, and others simply stared, unable to understand that the scene unfolding was not a movie but a cruel reality. That sense of disbelief made everything worse because the brain fought to deny what the eyes had seen. And yet the undeniable presence of death hung in the room like a heavy cloud. As panic spread, the sound of crying and shouting filled the restaurant. People pushed past each other, desperate to escape. Waiters abandoned their trays, chairs were knocked over, and dishes crashed to the ground. In the chaos, the truth became clear. The victim lay motionless, the attacker standing above, their presence cold and terrifying. For those who witnessed it up close, the image burned into their minds forever. The horror of seeing life ripped away with no warning cannot be forgotten, especially when it happens in such a public and ordinary place. No one goes to dinner thinking they will leave with trauma, but the witnesses carried scars deeper than any wound on the body. Each person's scream, every gasp, was part of the proof that this moment had destroyed what was once just another evening out. When the first wave of fear began to pass, people outside called for help. Sirens soon approached, the sound echoing down the street, mixing with the voices of frightened diners. Police arrived quickly, storming the restaurant, their presence a mixture of relief and renewed fear. They shouted commands, pushing everyone back, securing the area, and looking for any sign of the attacker's next move. At that point, no one knew if the violence would stop or spread. It was not just about one person who had been attacked. The entire room was trapped in fear, unsure if anyone else might become a victim. In every corner of the restaurant, eyes darted back and forth, breaths came in short bursts, and bodies trembled. The presence of officers gave some strength back, but the nightmare had already been carved into reality. Every true crime story carries a weight, but this one carries something else too, the feeling that safety can be shattered anywhere, even in the most ordinary places. This was not a dark alley or a hidden room. It was a public restaurant filled with witnesses, laughter, and the kind of atmosphere where no one expects to face danger. That contrast makes the tragedy heavier. People who left their homes in joy returned in shock, carrying images they could not erase. It is in moments like this when reality shows that crime does not knock before it enters. It arrives suddenly, in front of everyone, leaving questions, fear, and broken hearts. And that night, a restaurant meant for joy became a place marked by blood, screams, and a memory of murder that will never fade. The restaurant that had once been filled with warmth was now sealed off with yellow tape. The smell of food still lingered in the air, but it mixed with something heavier, something metallic and chilling. Officers moved through the scene with careful precision, marking evidence, photographing every detail, and speaking in low, serious voices. The body of the victim had been covered, but the outline of where they fell remained burned into the minds of the witnesses. Outside, a crowd had gathered, people whispering, some crying, others recording on their phones. The flashing red and blue lights turned the calm street into a stage of chaos. And while the officers worked, a question hung in the air: why had this happened? And who was bold enough to commit such a crime in front of so many eyes? Detectives arrived quickly, their eyes sharp, scanning the room for details that ordinary people would miss. They did not just see a restaurant. They saw a story written in broken glass, scattered chairs, and terrified faces. They began with the witnesses. One by one, people were pulled aside, their trembling voices recounting what they saw. Some had noticed the suspect enter earlier, sitting quietly at a table, watching, waiting. Others had noticed nothing at all until the moment of violence. The stories overlapped, creating a picture that was horrifyingly clear. This was no accident. The attack was deliberate, planned, and executed with cold precision. The detectives knew at once they were not dealing with random chaos. They were dealing with someone who had come here with intent. The restaurant's security cameras became the next crucial step. Investigators rushed to review the footage, watching frame by frame as the evening unfolded. They saw people laughing, waiters moving back and forth, plates being set down. Then, the moment of horror played out again, captured from multiple angles. The suspect's face, though partly shadowed, was visible enough. Every movement told a story. The way they entered without hesitation, the way they scanned the room, and the way they struck with such terrifying speed. Technology now carried the truth, and that truth would become the center of the investigation. Officers froze the images, printing out photographs, passing them around, and preparing to spread the suspect's face across the city. Meanwhile, forensic teams collected every piece of evidence. Fingerprints on glasses, drops of liquid on the floor, and the weapon left behind told a silent story of their own. The restaurant, which had once been a place of joy, was now treated like a crime lab. Every detail mattered. A footprint smeared across tiles, a napkin crumpled near the scene, and even the scattered belongings of the victim. All of it became evidence. Nothing was ignored, because in crimes like this, the smallest clue could break the entire case open. And the detectives knew they were under pressure. A murder so public, so brazen, demanded answers quickly. The entire city was already buzzing with rumors, and fear was spreading faster than facts. As witnesses were escorted out, many broke down in tears. Some spoke about the sound of the victim's last moments, others about the image of the suspect standing over the body. One woman whispered that she could never sit in a restaurant again without hearing the screams. Trauma does not fade quickly, and these people would carry scars invisible to the eye. Detectives noted every word, every detail, because in between the pain there were truths waiting to be discovered. Someone had seen something important, even if they did not realize it. A detail about the suspect's clothes, the way they moved, or the car they entered afterward could be the difference between justice and silence. Outside, the media swarmed. Reporters shouted questions, their cameras flashing, desperate for details. But the detectives said little. They knew that releasing too much too soon could jeopardize the case. Still, the public's hunger for answers grew by the hour. Who was the victim? Why were they targeted? Was this a personal attack or something larger, something darker? People demanded to know, because the thought that someone could strike so boldly in a crowded restaurant left them shaken. Safety felt like an illusion, and until the suspect was caught, no one felt secure. That fear gave detectives one more reason to move fast. They were not just solving a murder, they were restoring a city's trust. Back at the police station, a task force was assembled. Officers pinned photographs to a board, mapped out the timeline, and studied the suspect's every move. Names were whispered, possibilities discussed. Was this revenge, a professional hit, or a crime of passion that spilled out into public view? Every theory was tested, every lead pursued. Phones rang constantly, tips poured in, and the investigation deepened by the hour. But one fact was already clear: this crime was no ordinary act of violence. It was something calculated, meant to send a message. And as the detectives leaned over the evidence, one thought echoed in every mind. What message had the killer wanted the world to see? The investigation grew more intense when detectives finally confirmed the victim's identity. The covered body at the center of the restaurant was revealed to be a well-known figure in the community, someone whose life was tied to both respect and controversy. This revelation sent shockwaves through the city. Suddenly, the crime was no longer just an act of violence inside a restaurant. It was personal, political, and deeply complicated. The victim's history painted a picture of someone who had as many enemies as admirers. Business deals gone wrong, disputes with former partners, and whispers of involvement in matters that lived in the gray space between legal and illegal all surfaced. Detectives knew they had stepped into a storm where every lead could be connected to betrayal, revenge, or power. The question was not just who had killed them, it was who had the most to gain from their death. Detectives began pulling records, interviewing family, and questioning colleagues. Behind the polished surface of the victim's life, cracks began to show. There were stories of arguments, silent grudges, and debts unpaid. People described a personality that could charm in one moment and intimidate in the next. To some, the victim was a leader. To others, a manipulator. It was clear that the suspect could have been anyone from a close acquaintance to a rival determined to settle scores. The investigation grew wider with every detail, like a web pulling in more and more names. Each person brought into the questioning room carried a piece of truth mixed with fear, and detectives had to separate fact from lies. As they dug deeper, detectives found evidence that the victim had been receiving threats in the weeks leading up to the murder. Anonymous notes, strange calls, and warnings whispered by people who claimed to know something. The threats had been ignored, brushed aside as exaggeration, but now they stood as chilling foreshadowing. Someone had been preparing for this night, waiting for the perfect chance to strike. The restaurant was not a random choice, it was a stage. The suspect had chosen to kill in front of everyone, making the murder impossible to hide. It was not just about taking a life. It was about making a statement loud enough for the entire city to hear. Meanwhile, suspicion began to focus on a few key figures. Detectives noticed patterns in the interviews. A business partner who had lost millions in a failed deal, a relative with a bitter inheritance dispute, and a shadowy figure tied to the underworld all emerged as possible suspects. Each had motive, each had opportunity, and yet, none had been seen clearly enough in the restaurant that night. The security footage showed the attacker, but the face was partially hidden. Witnesses described conflicting details. Some said the suspect wore dark clothing, others remembered a light jacket. Some swore the attacker fled on foot, while others believed they saw a car speeding away. The confusion was almost too convenient, as if someone had planned it that way. Detectives decided to focus on the most promising lead, the business partner. This individual had been at odds with the victim for years, their relationship poisoned by lawsuits and public accusations. The partner had been in financial ruin, while the victim seemed to prosper. The motive for revenge was clear, but detectives needed proof. They tracked the partner's movements, checking phone records, surveillance, and bank activity. On the surface, the partner had an alibi, claiming to have been at a private event across town. But inconsistencies appeared. Phone records showed gaps, unexplained travel time, and messages that hinted at secrets not yet revealed. The detectives could feel the tension growing. They were close to something, but not close enough to make an arrest. At the same time, whispers about organized crime entered the investigation. The victim's ties to certain figures raised the possibility that this was not just a personal act, but a professional hit. Such crimes are carried out with precision, and the public nature of the murder fit the style of a message meant for rivals. Detectives could not ignore this angle, even if it complicated things. If the crime was tied to larger networks, solving it would not be simple. It would mean uncovering layers of corruption, alliances, and dangerous enemies who had no fear of killing in broad daylight. For detectives, the choice was clear. They had to push forward, no matter how dangerous the road became. While investigators built their theories, the community reacted with anger and fear. Candlelight vigils were held outside the restaurant, flowers placed along the sidewalk, and people gathered to mourn. But beneath the grief was a sharp edge of rage. How could such a crime happen in public, with so many witnesses, and the suspect still free? Families whispered that justice might never come, while others called for harsher crackdowns on crime. The entire city felt restless, waiting for answers that seemed too far away. And as the detectives sat in their offices late at night, surrounded by files and evidence boards, one question haunted them. Had they been drawn into a crime larger than they imagined, and would they survive uncovering the truth? Detectives pressed deeper into the tangled web of the victim's life, and the case began to shift from speculation to startling revelations. The breakthrough came late one night when investigators discovered new footage from a camera across the street, a small shop that had not been checked earlier. The angle was grainy, but it showed enough to confirm what had only been guessed. The suspect had indeed fled the scene on foot before disappearing into a side alley where a car waited with its engine running. This was no random act of rage. It was coordinated. The timing, the precision, and the presence of an accomplice all pointed to a plan set in motion long before that night at the restaurant. What detectives now needed to uncover was who had pulled the strings and why. Phone records offered the next piece of the puzzle. One of the potential suspects, the bitter business partner, had made a series of unusual calls in the days leading up to the murder. The numbers were unregistered, prepaid, and difficult to trace, but investigators were able to connect them to a burner phone purchased under a fake name. The timing of the calls matched perfectly with the hours leading up to the crime. This alone was suspicious, but combined with the inconsistencies in the partner's alibi, it became more than a coincidence. Detectives began to see a pattern. The partner may not have been inside the restaurant, but they could have orchestrated the event, hiring someone else to carry out the murder. Suddenly, the case took on the shape of a conspiracy, one that reached beyond personal anger into calculated revenge. Still, detectives were careful. An accusation this heavy required more than circumstantial evidence. They dug into financial records, tracing movements of money. What they uncovered was chilling: a large transfer of cash made just days before the murder, withdrawn in amounts small enough to avoid suspicion, but totaling a sum that matched what could easily be payment for a hired killer. The money trail, combined with the phone activity, painted a picture that was hard to ignore. Detectives knew they were close to pulling the mask off the orchestrator, but they needed the identity of the person who had actually committed the crime. That was the missing piece, and until it was found, the case would remain incomplete. Eyewitness testimony provided an unexpected lead. One waiter recalled seeing the suspect's hands when the weapon was raised. A distinctive tattoo on the wrist, partially hidden by a sleeve, had caught the waiter's eye. At the time, in the chaos, it seemed unimportant, but when mentioned during questioning, it became a critical clue. Detectives searched records for known criminals with similar markings, cross-referencing names tied to the victim's enemies. Within hours, a match was found. The tattoo belonged to a man with a history of violence, someone with links to organized crime and previous charges of intimidation. This was no amateur. The connection was undeniable, and suddenly the shadowy figure in the footage had a name. The puzzle was finally beginning to take shape. When detectives brought this suspect's name into the open, a darker truth unraveled. The man had been seen days earlier in the same part of town, near the business partner's office. Witnesses remembered him waiting outside, smoking, pacing, and then disappearing into a car with tinted windows. The link between the orchestrator and the hitman was now more than speculation. It was evidence. Detectives confronted the partner with the findings, presenting the financial records, the phone calls, and the sightings. The once confident figure began to show cracks. Their answers grew shaky. Their stories shifted, and eventually they demanded a lawyer. To detectives, this was as good as an admission. They knew they had cornered the mastermind behind the crime. But the story did not end there. As investigators pushed forward, they uncovered that the murder was not just revenge for personal betrayal. It was also a warning to others who might cross the partner in future business dealings. Killing in a public restaurant was no accident, it was a performance. The message was simple and brutal. Betrayal would be punished, and no amount of witnesses could save the victim. The sheer boldness of the crime made sense in this context. It was designed to terrify, to send ripples through both the community and the underworld. And while police were closing in, the damage had already been done. Fear had spread, and that fear was harder to erase than any single arrest. The final evidence came from a wiretap. Investigators had been monitoring calls between known associates of the hitman, and one conversation sealed the case. In it, the hitman bragged about the job at the restaurant and mentioned the name of the person who had paid. The recording was undeniable proof. Detectives now had both the orchestrator and the killer tied together in a chain of evidence so strong it could not be broken. Arrest warrants were prepared, and within days, raids were carried out. The hitman was taken into custody after a tense standoff, while the business partner was escorted from their home in handcuffs, their empire of lies crumbling in front of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. The trial began under a cloud of tension that hung heavy over the city. News crews camped outside the courthouse, reporters eager to capture every moment of a case that had shocked the nation. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Families of both the victim and the accused sat stiffly in the gallery, their faces carved with pain and anger. The jury members carried the weight of an entire community's eyes on them. This was not just a murder trial, it was a test of justice itself. Could the system deliver truth in the face of a crime so bold, so public, and so terrifying? From the opening statements, the atmosphere grew electric. The prosecution painted the story with precision. They laid out the money trail, the burner phone calls, the suspicious financial transfers, and the chilling coordination between the mastermind and the hitman. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the night at the restaurant, showing the jury how a casual dinner had been chosen as the stage for murder. Their words echoed with power. This was not an impulsive act, but a carefully designed execution meant to instill fear. The jurors shifted uncomfortably as graphic evidence was shown, footage of the attack, photographs of the aftermath, and the faces of witnesses who could barely contain their tears. The weight of the truth pressed down on everyone in the room. The defense, however, fought back with equal force. They argued that the evidence against the business partner was circumstantial, that the financial records could be explained as ordinary transactions, and that the hitman's claims were unreliable. They suggested alternative theories, that the victim had enemies elsewhere, that the murder was tied to organized crime beyond the partner's control. Their strategy was clear: sow doubt, create shadows, and weaken the certainty of the prosecution's narrative. For days, the jury was pulled between two powerful forces, each side presenting a version of events that could change lives forever. The most dramatic moment came when the hitman himself was brought to the stand. Shackled with eyes that revealed no remorse, he testified under pressure of a plea deal. His words carried a chilling calm as he admitted to the crime. He described how he had been paid, how he had been told exactly when and where to strike, and how the public setting was part of the plan. The courtroom fell silent as he pointed to the business partner, naming them as the one who had ordered the hit. Gasps filled the air, and the partner's face twisted in anger. The defense objected furiously, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it from the killer himself. The truth was no longer just theory, it was testimony. Witnesses from the restaurant were also called to relive their trauma. Some spoke in trembling voices about the chaos, the screams, and the horror of watching life stolen in front of them. One waiter broke down in tears as he described the tattoo on the killer's wrist, the very detail that had cracked the case open. Each account added layers of pain, but also layers of truth. The jury could see the scars left on ordinary people who had simply gone out for dinner and instead witnessed a nightmare. Their testimonies turned the case from a puzzle of facts into a human tragedy no one could deny. Weeks passed, but the tension never eased. Finally, the jury was sent to deliberate. The city waited in silence, hearts pounding, as hours stretched into a full day. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters pressed forward. Families clutched each other's hands, and the accused sat rigid, faces pale. The jury foreman rose, voice steady, and delivered the decision: guilty. Both the mastermind and the hitman were convicted of murder, conspiracy, and numerous related charges. The courtroom erupted. Some cried in relief, others in fury. The victim's family wept openly, clinging to each other as if justice had brought a sliver of peace to their broken lives. The sentencing sealed the story. The mastermind was given life without parole, while the hitman received a similarly heavy sentence, his plea deal only sparing him from the harshest possible punishment. The judge's words were stern, condemning the crime as one of arrogance and cruelty, a crime meant to terrorize not just a single person but an entire community. The gavel fell, and with it came a finality that left the courtroom buzzing with emotion. Justice had been delivered, but nothing could erase the memory of that night. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions, and the story spread across the nation. For the city, the verdict was both closure and a reminder. Closure, because the killers were behind bars. Reminder, because the crime had proven how fragile safety can be. People still spoke of it in hushed tones, the way trauma lingers long after justice is served. The restaurant never reopened. It stood as a silent monument to a night when laughter turned to screams. Some avoided the street entirely, while others left flowers there year after year. The place had become a scar in the heart of the city. In the end, this case became more than just a true crime story. It was a lesson in how darkness can strike in the most ordinary places, how greed and revenge can lead to destruction, and how justice, though slow, can still bring light. For those who had lived through that night, the memories would never fade, but the guilty verdict gave them something to hold on to. The belief that even in a world where safety can be stolen in a heartbeat, truth and justice can still stand tall. That night at the restaurant will never be forgotten. What was supposed to be an evening of food and laughter turned into a scene of terror, chaos, and loss. The sound of screams, the image of a life being taken in front of so many witnesses, and the panic that followed left a scar not just on the victims and their families, but on everyone who was there. Even today, people who were inside that room describe it as something they cannot escape. The smell, the sound, and the shock return to them in nightmares. Trauma is not something that fades quickly, and this case proved that even those who survive carry invisible wounds. The investigation that followed revealed more than just the identity of a killer. It pulled back the curtain on greed, betrayal, and cold calculation. What began as a horrifying act of violence inside a restaurant ended as a story of conspiracy, with one person orchestrating death for personal gain and another carrying it out without hesitation. The boldness of committing murder in front of an entire crowd was not random, it was a message, and that message shook an entire city to its core. People learned that evil can walk into the brightest places and destroy everything in a single moment. The courtroom became the final stage where truth fought against lies. Jurors, witnesses, and families all played their part in bringing justice. The mastermind and the killer were exposed, their arrogance crushed under the weight of undeniable evidence. The guilty verdict delivered closure to some, but it could never erase the pain. The family of the victim will always feel the absence. The witnesses will always remember the horror. And the restaurant, once a place of comfort, will always be remembered as the setting of a nightmare. Justice was served, but the story reminds us that justice does not undo tragedy. It only ensures that those responsible can never repeat it. True crime stories are often difficult to tell because they carry real pain, but they also carry real lessons.